Hello and welcome to Seminary Reacts, where we ask professors to react to Reddit stories and questions. Today I am joined by AMBS professor Leah Thomas. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Amy. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you here. So can you tell us a little bit about what you teach, what your passions are, what you feel like you have a lot of knowledge about?
Sure. So I teach pastoral care here, and I also direct contextual education. And pastoral care is sort of the counseling side of ministry. So we look at situations where people are accompanying others through grief or loss or other types of life situations and ask what's happening socially and emotionally and theologically. And then I also oversee students when they're in their internships or ministry placements. So I teach a class regarding that, and I also supervise students while they're in their placements.
Yeah, that's a lot of important work.
Yeah.
Before we dive in, what is your experience with Reddit? If you have any at all.
I don't know much about Reddit. I had to ask my stepchildren what this was exactly. They're in their early 20s, and they were telling me that people post questions, and then other people come and answer the questions, and sometimes they use it for certain things. So that's the limit to my knowledge.
Well, you are going to get super experienced with Reddit today.
Okay,
so
perfect.
I hope you're
cannot
ready.
wait.
There's a couple different subreddits that I'm going to be using questions and stories from. And yeah, we'll just take some time and answer some questions. There's some stories here that we'll look at too and try to see if we can offer any advice and just see what ways we can respond.
Perfect.
So are you ready for our first
Yes,
question
bring it on.
here?
Sounds great.
So this first question is coming from the subreddit Christian, and the title of the post is Service versus Doormat. And the post says, I don't know the difference between being a Christian servant and being a doormat that people use and take advantage of. My pastor's advice was to let these people use me, basically. I don't know what the right perspective is. I know this person who uses me as her personal taxi cab service and only talks to me when she wants something. I feel like I'm serving God by being a yes man to these people, but am I really? So this general question of what's the difference between doing service for God and kind of acting as a doormat and just letting people walk all over you and let them take advantage of you and whatever service you're giving. Where is that line between being a Christian servant and being a doormat?
Wow, what an interesting question.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that I really feel for whoever wrote this, that that's a really difficult situation to be in, and to be trying to do good work and to follow Jesus, and then also feeling like you're a yes man in that person's words. I think when we think about situations like this, it's really helpful to sort of back up and look at the entire picture of who Jesus was. A lot of times when we think about following Jesus, we think about like kindness and being merciful and compassionate, which is all wonderful things and all things that are laudable and all things that we should strive to emulate. And at the same time, though, when we look at the figure of Jesus and who he was like in totality, at least from what we know in the scriptures, Jesus was someone who was kind and compassionate. And Jesus was also someone who sort of called out situations of injustice. He was someone who was for the dignity and flourishing of all people. He was someone who allowed himself to be challenged and was challenged by people to see a fuller portrait of who was considered human. And he was a very complex figure, and he was also someone who, had spaces where he stood up and challenged people in authority and challenged them to be more loving and just, and particularly to those on the margins. And so I think, when I'm hearing what this person is asking, it's in some ways, we can take this message of Jesus and we can sort of flatten it, and we can make it all about love and kindness, which, like I said, are wonderful things. But we want to also look at the flip side of who Jesus was, which was about the dignity and flourishing of all people and the calling out of injustice, which at times, he actually was in the temple with whips, right? This was not just love and kindness. This was sort of a sense of righteous anger, a sense that that God requires certain things of us to be in relationship with one another. And that's all about sort of respecting the dignity of all humans and all of creation. So I would also say that when I'm thinking about this question, we know historically that people have used the example of Christ to continue to oppress people and to tell people on the margins of society that they should just turn the other cheek or bear their cross and not question situations of injustice, and that keeps people in situations of oppression when they are simply told that they should be kind, even in the face of someone who might be treating them in an unjust manner. And I think the witness of Christ calls us, in the name of dignity of all people, to challenge that injustice and to say that sometimes the best response is to say, what does kindness look like in the face of injustice, and how do we act in ways that lift up all people and create structures that honor the dignity of all people. That it's not about simply a personal decision of kindness, right? That it's also about this larger vision.
Yeah, yeah. I think that larger vision is. It seems like it would be very helpful to this person who's thinking about this, who's concerned that they're doing service, but they don't really know if they're actually making a difference here. I think maybe it would be helpful for this person to kind of understand that they're not just an individual person doing this work by themselves, but it is a part of a much larger system of believers doing a lot of service and serving people, but that it's not just on them, because it kind of feels like they're feeling that way.
Yeah.
That they have to be doing this work because, well, I'm called to be doing this work. So helping them get a little bit of perspective there might be helpful for them.
I agree with that sense of like being a part of a larger movement, and that we have each other, and that we're called to be different parts of this body together, right? And we're also called to care for ourselves, body and soul, and to choose things that are healthy for us, body and soul, rather than simply being a doormat for someone else as well. Yeah.
And I want to read a couple of the comments that people did put on this post, just because I think it brings up an interesting conversation here. We get a little bit more context as to what this person is experiencing. They go more in depth with this situation where they mention in what they said, I know this person who uses me as her personal taxi cab service and only talks to me when she wants something. So some of the comments have responded to that specifically. So one comment said, you seem to know the difference. So the difference between service and doormat. Service is done out of need and not just because you are available for anyone to use. You have better things to do with your time, and we are called to be good stewards of everything. Your pastor's advice is wrong. We are not to be used by people, but with the guidance of the Spirit, we are to discern which out of many needs we respond to. And then this other comment says that this post is lacking some context. This depends on the person who is in need. Are you the only person she can depend on in the world, and or she can't afford to pay? Then you might be showing her God's love in her time of need. If she can afford to pay for a cab, then just let her know how you feel. If you want her to talk to you more, then try to talk to her more and build a relationship. Sometimes they might feel like they're being a burden to you as it is, so they don't want to bother you when they don't need to. And the response from the poster said, she has other people, she pays me for the fuel, but I'm sick of driving and just being told to drive her places whenever she feels like it. I'm fed up, kinda don't want to talk to her. She acts like she's my friend, but a friend would bother talking to me at other times. She doesn't care if she's being a burden. And so a lot of these comments really are trying to parse out if this person is deserving of getting help, of asking this person to drive her places. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that I'm noticing here is this language of saying, well, if someone's treating you as a doormat, it depends on whether or not they're actually a person in need. So I wondered if there was any thoughts you had about that.
Right. I mean, we are good at that, right? Thinking about, well, is this person deserving of the help? And do they actually need my help? And so making that judgment about whether we offer, our help or we are generous in sort of light of that. So there's that tension. And, I think in those situations, right, it's sort of important to back up and say, like, we never know the whole story. Like, do we ever know someone's whole story? Do we ever know exactly why? Sometimes we ourselves don't know why we do or say certain things. And so how could another person possibly know that? We never know someone's full life story. We don't see the harm that they've endured. We don't see what might be motivating them. And so thinking that we can make an assessment on worthiness, right, really disregards this like very complex fabric of their lives and everything they've walked through and what might be kind of motivating them in that moment. So I always caution against trying to make an assessment to sort of pin down, like, is this person worthy? Like, should I help them? Right. And it also like flattens help into sort of, I will only offer my generosity to those who are worthy of it. So this sense that we're only called to help those who actually deserve the help. Right. And so it really just, it kind of like makes us the judge, right, of who's deserving and who isn't. So I see that happening like in these responses, right, and that's something that we sort of always want to be noticing in ourselves when we're kind of making that assessment. When we're sort of becoming God, right? Like, I decide who's worthy, and I decide who's worthy of my help and others' helps. That can be a really slippery slope. And at the same time, right, we can't possibly just continue to give and give and give. That we will have nothing left of ourselves, right? And so, even Jesus had times when he said, okay, I need space away. I need space to recharge. I need space to pray. I need space to replenish my soul. That boundaries are compassionate and necessary for ourselves in order to like find spaces to feed our soul, to replenish our soul, to sort of reconnect with who we are, with who God is calling us to be. And they're compassionate to others because they let people know I'm available here and I'm not available here, right? And so it's very compassionate to sort of to be very honest and transparent in our communication about when we are available to help and when we're not. And so this sense of sort of this balancing act, right, of sort of being generous with our time and our treasure and our talents, and also holding that alongside those times when we need to sort of feed our own souls and allow God to feed us and allow God to fill us, and in order that we can be who we're called to be, right? So this sort of balancing act, I think, is going on here.
Yeah. So like this poster, I mean, it seems like they're getting some fatigue from the amount of service they're doing in this situation. And so it might be worth kind of like checking in with themselves and kind of understanding like why they're feeling like this. And I think like kind of confronting the fact that they're getting to the point that they're thinking, well, I don't think this person deserves my help. Like that's a point to stop and say, okay, what's going on here? And kind of evaluate, maybe at this point it's time for this person to stop doing this because they feel like they're at capacity. But yeah, having them self-reflect a little bit and take care of themselves, it definitely seems like that would be important.
Absolutely.
In this scenario.
Yeah, agreed. Yes.
Yeah. Are you ready to move on to our next
Absolutely,
story here? So this next story is going to be mentioning religious trauma. It's not mentioned in detail, but there is mention of that in the story. This story is coming from the subreddit, Am I the but we will be using the language, am I in the wrong?
Okay.
Basically, this subreddit is where people are posting and asking, am I in the wrong in this situation? So we have this story coming from the subreddit called, Am I in the Wrong for Walking Out in the Middle of My Sister's Church Service? So the story here says, I, a 21-year-old female, just moved in with my sister, 27-year-old female, who was excited to take me to her church for the first time. I have had a lot of issues with the church, so it is always a big deal for me to go to a new church. On the way there, I was being quiet, so she said, "Why are you being so boring?" I told her I was tired. I was actually tired, but more so anxious to go to a new church because of the social and religious setting. Once there, she introduced me to a few people who I had to make small talk with. The service starts, and at this point I started to panic, so I went to the bathroom, where I eventually had a panic attack. I was having trouble calming myself down, so I texted my sister that I didn't feel good and was going to walk home. I didn't even have the keys to get back into the house, but I didn't want to make a scene by interrupting the service to go get them. I ended up getting home after her, and when I walked in, she just kind of side-eyed me, so I went to my room because it felt tense. She knocked on my door a few minutes later to talk about it. She was absolutely livid and demanded an explanation. I smiled, not out of amusement, but out of shock, which made her angrier. I started to explain myself, but started crying in the process, which she laughed at, so I left the room. I later told her I'm ready to talk, and she starts by saying I embarrassed and blindsided her in front of the whole church and that it was rude to leave like that. I explained that I had a panic attack because of religious trauma and social anxiety, to which she responds, "What religious trauma?" I won't go into detail here, but she knows that I have a lot of deeply hurtful and personal issues with the church. She then brings up how I'm ungrateful about letting me live with her and demands I pay the rest of my rent. We had multiple conversations before I moved in where I explicitly told her I wouldn't be able to pay my rent on time because I'm unemployed, and she was super understanding and totally fine with it. Am I in the wrong? I definitely could have communicated better, so I understand my sister's reaction to an extent. And then we have a little bit of more information here with a later edit. I left out a lot of context out of this post in an effort to make it easier to read, but I will add it now to address the confusion. The reasons I have issues with the church stem from being religiously homeschooled with little access to the outside world. This was obviously an extremely conservative and hateful environment, which would negatively impact any child, but I was also closeted at the time, along with being a girl. My sister was not homeschooled and is straight. The differences in our education are just because our parents started changing their parenting style as they had more kids. Going to church was not a requirement of me moving in with my sister. I accepted her invitation because this church community is something she really values, so I wanted to support her in something that is important to her. Personally, I am religious at most and spiritual at least. I believe in God, but would not call myself a Christian because of the harm Christianity, especially white evangelical nationalism, has done to so many people, including myself. However, I have been exploring very progressive church options, mostly for the sense of community they provide, including the one mentioned in the post. I have never had a panic attack at church, despite my issues with Christianity, so I thought the anxiety was a feeling that would pass as it usually does when I try a new church. And about the social anxiety, I am able to interact with others completely normally, including small talk, despite it giving me anxiety. Going into a completely new environment, however, where my sister said I would have to stand in front of the congregation to introduce myself, was also adding to the anxiety. So again, this question that this person is asking is am I in the wrong for walking out of the church in response to some of the feelings she was having?
Wow, yeah.
There's a lot here.
There's a lot there,
Yeah.
goodness. Well, let me start by saying, there's a lot of talk about trauma right now. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people both talking about it and sort of claiming to be traumatized, and we're sort of at a point in society where it's kind of getting a lot of distress is kind of getting collapsed into trauma. So sometimes it can be difficult to parse out, okay, what is trauma really? What does it mean to be traumatized? What is this thing, religious trauma, right? And how does this all function? And there's a couple of scholars who talk about maybe reframing this in terms of like a distress trauma continuum, right? That trauma is real. And yet there are a lot of forms of distress and being uncomfortable and distress and et cetera. And they all are not necessarily trauma, but that doesn't mean that they are not important in their own right. They deserve care, right? They deserve to be sort of acknowledged. And so, so I just want to posit that to say, we don't have enough information to discern, like, does this person have religious trauma? We could conjecture a few things based on what she shared. But what I want to say about experiences where trauma might be involved is that, when we think about psychological trauma, it's sort of a series of, so it can be one event or a series of events or a set of conditions, right, that overwhelm someone's ability to integrate their emotional experience. This can also happen in a community, that overwhelm their ability to integrate their experience. So that could be to be present, to fully comprehend what's happening, to understand what's happening. And basically the event or series of events is perceived as a threat. So it's a threat to life, to integrity, to body, to sanity. And that the experience of trauma lives in just that. It's someone's experience of the event. So while you and I could experience the same event, for one of us, it could be like mildly or distressing, and the other one could have a full-blown trauma response to a particular event, because all of these factors converge, like she was saying, upbringing and social location and previous experiences of trauma converge in someone's perception of an event as traumatic. But when the body perceives an event as traumatic, it just reacts, right? So it's more of a primal reaction that comes from our lizard brain, our reptilian brain, that submits all these neurochemicals to send us into fight, flight, or freeze. And so it affects things like memory, it affects things like cognition, it affects things like our ability to be present. It can bring on something like a panic attack. It can overwhelm us, it can send us into flashbacks, right? It can, it can do a lot of different things, both mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It's a full-bodied response. And it's the body's attempt at survival in a situation it perceives as dangerous. And now, what we know about religion is that it's very complex, because religion can be both a source of trauma and it can be an antidote to trauma. So for some people, depending on the types of trauma that they've experienced in their life, religion can be really comforting. It can be something that it gives them a sense of meaning and purpose in the midst of a highly chaotic environment and inner environment. And yet, we also know that certain types of religiosity and certain types of religion can actually be a catalyst for trauma. And so we do know that things like more fundamentalist forms of religion, more rigid forms of religion, certain doctrines that position God as like punitive or sending people to hell or condemning people or seeing them as certain parts of themselves are no longer welcome, that are, so certain kind of doctrinal positions. In certain communities, we know that abuse can and does happen, whether that's sexual abuse or otherwise, that power can be abused. And so we know that both in religious communities and religious belief systems can be encoded and experienced by the body as traumatic. If someone has experienced that type of religious upbringing, and particularly over time, it sounds like this person was like secluded, had a homeschool environment, had a religiosity that was sort of pretty rigid, that condemned parts of that person's self. If they've experienced that as traumatic over time, it is actually pretty understandable that they would be triggered in a worship service. And it actually, it could have happened in any worship service, and depending on the constellation of what might happen in that worship service, particularly having to kind of stand up in front of people at a worship service, that someone could be thrust into trauma responses, which is what could have happened here. And in that case, the best thing that a person can do is actually take care of themselves, and if that means leaving the service, then that is the best thing for that person to do in order to regulate their emotions, to start to move, to get into their body, right? To feel their body beneath them, right? So we do know that once the body gets thrust into fight, flight, or freeze, right? That we need to do whatever we can to start to establish safety. And for this person, it sounds like our body sort of decides the best option was to leave. Now, It might be that that the sister doesn't quite understand all of these intricate dynamics, and I also want to say, it's understandable that the sister might want to share this church that's really meaningful with her sister, and maybe knowing that her sister has had some difficulties with religion in the past. And it's also understandable that she might feel a bit of embarrassment if her sister walked out. And yet, I want to hold that, given the sort of what we know about this situation and the likely prevalence of trauma in this situation, and if not trauma, it could also just be seen as a very distressing event, that this was probably the best option for her sister to leave the service and to take care of her emotional and physical and mental health. So, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's I think it's a really great way of framing this whole scenario. Like, obviously we don't have every little bit of detail about these two sisters and how they've gotten along. It is interesting to me that that the older sister has had such a different upbringing than her sister has. Yeah,
for sure.
And I think, like, one of those lines from this story that sticks out to me is that phrase of what religious trauma. It really does seem like, because their upbringings have been different, and just because they are different people, that they've had a very different experience of the church.
Yeah.
And so, like, of course this would be difficult for who posted this to be kind of in this stance where maybe she grew up in the same household as her sister, but she's had a very different experience with religion.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, I mean, the big joke is sort of, you can have two people raised in the same household and they can have two very different narratives of what went on in that household, because they're very different people and have different roles, and there are different amounts of time between they were brought up, and the family system likely evolved over time and looked a little bit different. And then people have their own individual personalities and sort of experiences of parents and attachment to parents. And so even though siblings can be raised in the same household, they can have very different experiences of that household and of religion in that household, and just even what happened in that household. And they can even have different memories that stand out to them, right? Based on their experience of being in that household. So yes, it does make sense that two siblings would not have had an identical experience of religion, even though they were brought up in the same household. Even if they were identical twins, they likely would not have had an identical experience of religion. Religion is a very personal part of ourselves, it's a sacred part of ourselves, and there's just, there's a lot of individuality in sort of our religious worldviews and our belief systems.
Yeah. And kind of going back to something you said before, I think it's interesting, like you've mentioned, that with religion, it can be like a catalyst for trauma, but it could also be, I don't know what the phrasing you used, an antidote. And I think it's interesting that this poster has talked about how they've been exploring very progressive church options, mostly for the sense of community they provide. And so it seems like, in a way, they are kind of trying to do that too. And I think that seems like it's a tricky thing for someone to know that they've had religious trauma, and they know that they would like to experience the more antidotal parts of religion, but trying to balance that with the reality that it could trigger some of the trauma, the thoughts and feelings that are associated with that at the same time.
What strikes me as a really courageous move, right? To know that you have these really distressing reactions, potentially, and yet it sounds like there's a part of her that knows that she wants and needs religion in her life and wants to have a different experience of religion. And it would be interesting to have a conversation with this person about like, because some people having her upbringing might just do this, right? They might say like, I don't need religion anymore. I'm done with religion. I'm done with spirituality. But that is not what she's doing. She's doing this, and she's saying like, I actually want religion as part of my life, even though I've had some potentially or traumatic elements of my religious experience. Like, I still want to explore this, and I find it important. And so that's a really courageous move to make, and it speaks highly of the importance of religion, and that religion, and I like to say this, religion and God is bigger than a denomination. That denominations can and do, and communities can and do. We're made up of humans. We hurt people. There's harm that's inflicted. There's harm that's received. And yet there's something, God, the Spirit, however you want to image the divine, is larger and still beckoning her even in the midst of the harm. I think it's really beautiful.
Yeah. I like that description of this is a very courageous action that she's taken. And even though it didn't necessarily work out the way that she was hoping it would, it's still definitely a really great thing that that she did. Okay, any other thoughts about this one before we move on to our next story?
You know, I would also say I think this story really speaks to the importance of congregations knowing more about trauma and being explicitly trauma informed in their worship and in their care for each other. And that's something that's really, there's a burgeoning movement around being more trauma informed in a lot of different areas. But you know, there's a lot of people in congregations who have experiences. They might have experiences of religious trauma, but it might be other types of trauma that they're carrying. And for congregations to have just a greater awareness that this is a possibility, that people can have reactions that look like this posters, and to be intentional about their worship and about their communal relations, I think is really something we need to be talking more about.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Are you ready for our next question?
I am.
All right, so this next one is coming from another subreddit that's asking this question of, am I in the wrong? Sometimes on these subreddits, there are people that will ask, would I be in the wrong? So that's the way that this original poster, OP, is stating this. And the question is, what do you say when someone asks you if they're going to heaven in their final days and you don't think they are? Mom is in her last stage of life and asked me if she's going to heaven. I'm a recent Gnostic Christian, and she professes her love of Christ and the belief in what God did for us. Yet she is full of bitterness and unforgiveness that is separating her from God's love. No form of repentance in nearly 70 years. I mean, I know what to say, but what do you think? This is my very first Reddit post as well. And I think this one's interesting because of the range of comments that are here, so I want to read some of those too. So one comment says, you say, yes, Mom, you will. Then you say prayers with her. There is nothing you can do, no point in making her final days worse than they have to be. Another comment is, tell her there is no God, and you need to burn your Bible and think for yourself. So that's a perspective we're seeing here.
Okay.
And then this final perspective is, look at what the Bible says about salvation. By repentance and faith, believing with one's heart and professing with one's lips that Jesus Christ is Lord. The book of James teaches us about showing our faith in our deeds and behavior, but I don't think that this means that someone who hasn't done this won't go to heaven. However, the Bible also warns that even the devil believes. I would gently say that it is wonderful that she believes and professes faith in Christ, but salvation requires repenting of our sin and turning away from it, and ask whether she has also done that. If so, I think she will be in heaven, even if she has not forgiven others or resolved other issues. But if not, I think you should encourage her to confess her wrongdoings and submit to the lordship of Christ as ruler over her life. So we see a big variety here, the comments.
Oh my goodness, okay.
But I think, I'm particularly thinking of, if you're a person who's watching someone in the last stage of their life, and you want to bring them comfort, and you want to be a helpful presence in that place, how do you do that? How do you answer that kind of question?
What an interesting question. So, I mean, I guess I want to, there's a lot of complexity in this situation.
Right.
And it's a mother-daughter kind of, relationship here. There's the daughter who's commenting on the mother's sort of spiritual life, and the mother who's asking if she's going to heaven in her final days. And the daughter also, it seems to me there's a bit of harm there. And so I guess I want to start by just acknowledging that relationships with parents can be really complicated, and that they hopefully evolve over time. But and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they stay stuck, and there can be a lot of issues, and there could be a lot of unresolved issues and harm that is named and unnamed, and sometimes many times unnamed in these relationships. And so I'd start by saying it seems like there's some harm in this relationship, and that's real for the daughter. And sometimes the person who caused the harm is not the person that we can process the harm with. That we need other people, whether they be pastors or therapists or mentors, to help us process some of the harm from our family of origin, so that we can be more present with the people in our families, even when harm might be present. So, I guess I would want to start by saying, the daughter may or may not be the right person to sort of accompany her mother in this the exploration of this question, because her daughter has a lot of her own kind of what we would say stuff around it, and her own opinions around it, and what we want to kind of, when we look at this situation, what we also see is someone who's approaching the end of life. And it's quite common at the end of life for larger existential questions about life and one's own life and what life means and whether I lived a good life and my regrets and all of that to surface at the end of life. And so rather than kind of zeroing in on am I going to heaven, I might counsel the daughter to sort of pause and step back and be curious about what's beneath this question. Right? This question could be connected to regrets, to worry, to anxiety about her own future, to a sense that maybe she has done some wrong in her life, and it could be connected to a lot of larger things. And so what I often sort of suggest for folks is to sort of step back and get curious about I wonder why you're asking this now, or I wonder what this question is about, or I wonder what brought this question up at this moment. Could you tell me more about that, right? And that brings it out of the are you going to heaven or aren't you going to heaven, and who gets to decide, which again, I mean, we aren't God, right? Even though the daughter has seen much of her mother's life, she wasn't there for every moment of her daughter's life and doesn't see the whole story. She wasn't there for her mother's childhood and any of the wounding that might have occurred there. And similarly, the mother hasn't been there for her daughter's entire life. No one except God sees the full story, and we don't get to make these decisions. Probably for the best, in terms of what happens after we die. But what we can do is be present with someone as they're trying to sort of discern what their life is about, and whether their life had meaning, and what regrets they might have had, and what they might have wished for themselves, and where they are as they're looking back over their life and looking towards something different. So maybe if the daughter feels comfortable stepping back and having this larger conversation, I would say that's one option. But I also want to hold it, maybe the daughter doesn't, and maybe it's too activating for her to have this kind of conversation with her mother, given what she knows about her mother. And I would say, so there's no obligation here. There's no obligation to have a conversation that the daughter isn't ready to have, or feels like it's too activating for her to have, right? And in that case, it's fine to simply say, hey, Mom, wow, that's a really important question. It's a really big question. And I'm here with you, as you're discerning these questions and thinking about these questions, right? To sort of offer presence rather than an answer to a question like that is also something that can be really healing for a relationship like that.
Yeah. I think it's really good to pick up on that. I mean, that phrasing of she's full of bitterness and unforgiveness, and this language of, well, I know what to say, but I think that really does, it feels like it reveals some of that relationship with her mom. And yeah, it definitely feels like it's more than just a question, that in the way that the daughter is experiencing it. Potentially because of experiences she has had with her mom. I wonder too if you could speak to this certainty aspect of it. And I know this is something we've talked about in classes.
Yeah.
Just this, when someone is acting as a supportive listening voice or listening ear or trying to give advice, there's often like this differentiation between like the person who's listening might have a particular set of beliefs and might be listening to this person and say like, oh, that's not theologically correct. That's not biblical or whatever. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that dynamic of how to be supporting people when you're kind of listening and saying, well, that's not technically correct.
That's a great question. So I think what comes to mind as you're asking that question is this notion that we all sort of have different kind of forms of theology that take up residence within us, right? We have an embedded theology, which is sort of these pre-critical beliefs that were sort of implanted even before we could speak, that these are things about maybe God and life that we many times don't even know we're there, but they come out in situations of stress. And then we have like what we say we believe, right, which is our espoused theology. And then we have our lived theology, which is our beliefs and our actions and our values and our ways of coping. And those are the things we actually live. And all of this are they're messy. It's a messy amalgam of beliefs, and they might not, and many times are not coherent, like doctrinal positions, right? They're lived, and they're brought forth in different kinds of circumstances. And what we say we believe might be different than what we actually believe. And our embedded theology, we might not even agree with it when it surfaces, right? And so when we're accompanying someone through theological questions, what we're also discerning is sort of what is life-giving in terms of their theology, right? So we're looking at their theological worldview, and we're looking at their beliefs and their values and the way that they're coping. And how is it functioning for that person in the moment, right? Is it life-giving for them? And what aspects are life-giving and lead them more towards love and compassion and openness? And what aspects of that theological worldview might be life-limiting, might be leading them towards cynicism, might be leading them towards closing themselves off from others. And so partly it's recognizing that when we're really accompanying someone, and if we're trying to be like in a caregiver role with someone, that it's not really about our theology, right? We're trying to discern how to best accompany them and support them in sort of living into those life-giving beliefs and practices that are really like functioning to bring them towards compassion, towards greater goodness, towards love, towards mercy, and also helping them to sort of identify when maybe certain religious and beliefs are life-limiting and are really causing them to go more towards shame or doubt, causing them to shut down, causing them to be less compassionate, and helping them to sort of name that for themselves too, right? To really discover that for themselves, to name that for themselves, to choose for themselves what they want to live into.
Yeah. And I think in the way that some of these comments kind of read, I think there is that push to say like, well, there is the right answer, tell her the right answer. And I can understand being in a position and saying like, okay, but I want to correct them. Like I want them to get to the right answer here.
Indeed.
But I think kind of what you've said here is like letting that person kind of ask the questions themselves and really ponder that and kind of understand their situation and whatever theological questions they're asking themselves. Allowing them to go on that process it seems like it's a much more, I don't know if effective is the right word, but a meaningful way for them to be experiencing that, whereas somebody kind of stepping in and saying like, okay, I hear what you're saying, but that's actually not correct. That's not theologically correct.
Right.
That just doesn't seem as helpful, because it feels more like, I mean, might make the person defensive, and they might feel like they can't be processing these things.
Yeah.
So I think like, well, there is a tendency to step in and say like, actually, I need to correct you about this. Saying like, taking the time to just kind of step back and let them explore can be more helpful for their processing of whatever theological question they've posed.
Absolutely. I mean, I love how you're saying, really, when you're accompanying someone, you're really allowing them to explore, and you're supporting them in their exploration, and you're also trusting that God is at work in them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you believe that God lives inside of them? That God is calling them and inviting them into wholeness and flourishing, and that journey might look a little bit different than yours.
Right.
Right? And can you trust that God is at work and that you, in embodying love and compassion and accompanying them and allowing them the space to truly discover and ask questions and start to try things on and in relationship, that the Spirit is at work in that and is going to bring them to wherever the Spirit needs to bring them, right? So it's sort of also trusting that we don't have to be the ones that correct, right? That God and the Spirit lives in each of us, and that Spirit is around us and in between us and is always sort of, they talk about luring us to greater possibility, to fullness, to wholeness, and so what we can do is offer someone that, I say the greatest gift we can offer someone is truly listening, truly hearing their questions, letting them know we've heard them, giving them space to tell their stories, right? And to also attend to the ways that the Spirit is at work in that through the relationship that's developing. So yes, can we trust that God is at work in that movement, I think is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I know I see there are so many posts that come up on Reddit where someone is posing this kind of question, which is, I mean, either they've done something or they're planning on doing something, but asking these questions about, like, there's this person who I'm supporting in some sort of way, how am I doing this? Or they'll talk about ways that they've said things that are not necessarily helpful. And I think in all of the comments that I often see, I feel like that piece is often missing, that piece of allowing God to continue to be at work in that person, in their processing, in their prayers, and their questioning, because I mean there is such a tendency for people to like see what's happening and then say like, okay, well I got to take control here. I gotta be the one with the answers. But I think being willing to say, okay, I don't have the answer here, and I want this person to explore this themselves it's allowing for God to be at work and not putting ourselves at the center of it.
Yeah,
so
absolutely, right? And recognizing that the mystery of God is so much bigger than any one of us, right?
Right.
That we all have a little piece, right? And yet we need each other to help us really live into this beautiful mystery that is God. And we learn from each other's experience more about God when we allow someone to tell their story and to show us who God is in their life and to get a glimpse of their struggles in terms of what they're carrying. We also learn more about who God might be and how God is working in the world, right?
Yeah, yeah. All right, ready for our final story here?
Sounds good.
So this last one, we've had a lot of conversation about family dynamics here, and this one is no different. So this one is coming from the subreddit, Reddit on Wiki, which sometimes people are reposting stories from other subreddits. So the title for this one is, Am I in the Wrong for Telling My Daughter Jesus is Her Grandma's Imaginary Friend? So OP says, me, a 30-year-old male, and my wife, 32-year-old female, have had frequent conversations with my mother-in-law about keeping her beliefs to herself. My wife believes in the Christian God, and my own beliefs are less defined, but leave room for the possibility of a single omnipotent presence. My issue isn't with my mother-in-law's beliefs, but the fact that she won't stop trying to, quote-unquote, save my daughter's soul. She's Catholic. She has taken my daughter, 5 years old, to church and told her to keep it a secret from me, taught her to pray in secret before bed, etc. My daughter gravitates to the idea because it's fun to imagine a man living in the sky, but to me, exposing children to such concepts before they develop the ability to think critically is pure indoctrination. Finally, I got tired of trying to encourage my daughter to keep an open mind and told her that her grandma has an imaginary friend called Jesus, and that's who she's always talking about. I told her not to tell her grandma because grandma truly believes Jesus is real. My wife did not like this. She said I was teaching our daughter to think of their grandmother as silly and closing her mind to the concept of Christianity in the future. I told my wife that if it were my mom, she wouldn't be allowed around our children anymore, and she called me an asshole for not talking to her about how best to approach the situation first. The situation has been ongoing since our daughter was born. If anyone has any earnest suggestions for how I could better handle the situation, I am all ears.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's quite a situation. Well, as I hear this, what strikes me first is that religion and religious beliefs can be a source of real consternation in a family, not just throughout the generations, whether it's mother and daughter and son-in-law, it sounds like, but even among siblings, like different religious beliefs, different worldviews, can really cause a lot of tension. I think that's what we're seeing here, right? In these decisions that are being made, and I also want to name that, like, this is. I'm speaking from a Western perspective here, and that in more collective societies, right? I think this looks a little bit different in terms of, in a Western worldview, it's really the purview of the nuclear family. So it's the parents who we see them as the first teachers of the faith, and so they are the people that as part of upbringing, sort of share their faith or their lack of faith with their children, and sort of orient the child to the religious world, whatever that might be. And in a Western society, it's really the purview of the parents to share that. Now, of course, we might take issue if they're sharing beliefs that cause harm to self or others, or cause hatred, but there's a lot of freedom in terms of that nuclear family, and in terms of the role of the parents in sharing their beliefs. And so it does become more complex, right, when the generation above has very different beliefs and also is involved in wanting to pass those on to the child.
Right.
And it seems like this is an issue that really needs to be addressed between the parents and the grandparents, right? That the child is sort of the, as we call it in family systems theory, like the one that's getting triangulated,
right?
So, right, and it's sort of allowing them to avoid this large issue that's happening between the two of them. That said, I do want to comment for a moment about this Jesus being grandma's imaginary friend. I mean, there's a lot you can say about Jesus. There's a lot of different beliefs about who Jesus was, what his life meant, but Jesus actually existed. We know this from Scripture. We know this from sources outside of Scripture, such as Josephus, that he was actually a person that walked on the earth. There's a lot of disagreement about what that life meant, about what it means to follow Jesus. If you want to follow Jesus, was he God? Was he not God? Did he rise from the dead? There's a lot of disagreement and a lot of different opinions, but to say he's just an imaginary friend is actually erroneous. I mean, so you can talk about Jesus and say, in terms of giving credence to who he actually was, and also share, and we believe X, without making Jesus an imaginary friend. So I do want to push back in terms of that a bit, to sort of say there's a way of communicating maybe displeasure with, or a difference in belief, without making Jesus into an imaginary friend. That said, I do think the real issue is sort of needs to be worked out among the adults here, because what is happening is a child is sort of getting caught between these two, and sort of, and of course the child doesn't know, right? And so it's probably fairly confusing for the child here in terms of, well, what do I believe in? What should I believe in? I've got these two, my mother and my father and my grandmother, who I both respect and love very much, saying very different things, and how do I negotiate that? And really what needs to happen is there needs to be some conversation among the adults about this faith formation.
There's this secrecy aspect too that I really don't like. Between like the grandmother telling her granddaughter to don't say anything about this. Don't make sure when you're praying you're doing it in secret, and so nobody can see you. But then also the father stepping in and I mean saying talking to the daughter too about his perspective, but also saying, don't tell your grandma, don't talk about this. So that's a really tough space to be. I mean, it doesn't say how old this daughter is, but oh no, it does. 5 years old. That's a
oh my goodness.
That's really hard for a 5-year-old to be.
Of course.
Thinking about.
Yes, and the child is not old enough or mature enough to sort of say, I'm not going to keep secrets for you, or I'm not going to,
right.
So you have these sort of competing things that are being asked of this child, and this secrecy, you know, and around religion. And I mean, like, we could continue to build this out about how problematic this could be for faith formation for a child growing up. But yes, and again, that secrecy speaks to, right, probably the reason that there hasn't been a sit down between these two, right, that there's not actually direct communication, that there are things that are hidden that can't be talked about, that are not talked about, and whether they're because they're not safe to talk, we don't know the situation here, but it does speak to the fact that there's not a lot of, you know, direct, compassionate, transparent communication going on between the adults, because they're actually trying to hide what they're doing from one another. So it tells us a little bit there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I will say, like, the people who've responded to this, left comments with this type of post, there's often, I mean, that's asking the question of, am I in the wrong? And sometimes we get cases where people say, everyone sucks here, which is, I mean, just a way of saying, like there's a lot that's going wrong on both sides of the situation when you're looking at what this father is doing, but also his mother, like, in relationship with his mother-in-law and what the mother-in-law is doing. Like, this one comment is saying, like, this is a case of everyone sucks here. Your mother-in-law is majorly overstepping boundaries. And this person says that I'm agnostic and I'm not a fan of organized religion in general. And if my in-laws were doing this with my kid, it would be grounds for a serious conversation and possibly not allowing them to spend time with my kiddo unsupervised. I think the biggest red flag here is that grandma wants your kid to keep it a secret from you. This is a bad precedent to set, religious angle aside. But telling your child that Jesus is grandma's imaginary friend is pretty dismissive of and pretty respectful to your mother-in-law and your own wife's beliefs, because it said that his wife is a Christian too. You don't want grandma to indoctrinate your daughter, but you're doing the same thing. By telling her that Jesus is imaginary, you're prejudicing her to disbelief with a heavy helping of implication that people who do believe are childlike or crazy. So we have this overall verdict of people in the comments kind of saying, everyone sucks here, which is strong language. That's just kind of how the internet does it. But yeah, just saying, like, there's a lot that should be better in this situation from both angles.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of those critiques are sort of, I mean, I'm not sure about the everyone sucks. They're valid, right? To say, to sort of name, and I do want to point out, you know, like, what is assumed in some of those is this sort of Western model, right? That, like, it's really parents who are the ones that have the responsibility and the freedom to educate, and, like, if the mother-in-law is to intervene, that's wrong. Like, that's a very a more individualistic view of how faith formation were to happens, and that it might look different in a different culture, and so we just want to be cognizant of that too.
Yes, definitely, definitely. And I think it's interesting the way that the daughter has kind of been centered in this, because I know, like, it's all about her, but at the same time, it doesn't seem like they're worried about what's best for her in a lot of this. Yeah. Like, I think it's a lot about, like, well, the grandma wants to be able to teach her what she believes. Well, also the dad wants to be able to teach her what she's going to believe, but it's not, like, centering the daughter in her well-being and her faith formation in this in a lot of ways. So there is a lot more that probably should be happening as in a conversation, if there were a conversation that happens between this this grandma and this girl's dad. I mean, it should be about the well-being of the 5-year-old girl and what's going to be best for her as she's developing her faith as a kid.
I think that's a very astute comment, and you're absolutely correct that is very crucial and seems to be missing from this story in terms of, like, yes, the person with the least amount of power here, right, and the persons who we should be sort of centering is this child and their well-being and their own faith formation. And what is all of this? What is this doing to this child? How is it impacting them? How's it impacting not only their religious worldview, which I'm sure it is, but just even like ability to relate and to adults in her life, trust issues, and these types of issues are all present here.
Right. We do have this final edit from the person who posted, just giving some reflections after being told what they were told by the people in the comments. So the edit says, to clarify, I am not an atheist. My personal belief is that there is a power greater than ourselves, but pretending to have the answers is understandable but ignorant. Regardless, I am in the wrong for handling the situation the way I did. I was furious at the time, but that's not an excuse. My wife made some great points this morning about how we can approach similar situations in the future, and she has agreed to put her mom on notice that next time is the last time. I don't want my daughter to lose out on a relationship with her grandma who thinks she's doing the right thing. Teaching my daughter to keep secrets from us is the worst offense, but hopefully she won't feel like that's necessary if we compromise on once a month Sunday school or something which I can balance out at home. Any more overstepping from grandma and she's cut off, and I'm going to explain things more clearly and honestly to my daughter and trust her to understand. Thank you for all of your advice and for knocking some sense into me.
Wow, okay, interesting. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that final edit with me.
Yeah, this is kind of a rare moment where we see someone who is in some sort of situation where either they're in the wrong or they're in a situation where everybody sucks here. And they have actually taken to heart what people have said in the comments and said, okay, I see what you're saying, so that should actually lead to some sort of change. So I think that says a lot of good to me about this person who posted, because they're willing to say, all right, I'm in the wrong, and they're admitting that on the internet and being willing to kind of respond to that. And it seems like there are some good steps in place to try to rectify the situation and try to keep a healthy relationship between the grandma and the father and the daughter here.
It does seem that way. So, yeah. Wow. Well, thank you.
So to wrap up here, are there any reflections you have about Reddit and what questions people have? And
I will say I had no idea that people were sharing sort of some of these intimate stories from their lives and seeking wisdom in this space. So I'm actually really glad to know this. I'm glad to be, I guess, a voice, one more voice, offering insights on this. And thanks for asking me to be here.
Yeah.
I'm honored.
Yeah, thank you for joining me here. It's been really great to hear all of your responses to these. I'm sure they will be helpful to a lot of people who've been thinking about these things. Yeah.
I hope so.
And thank you for listening to Seminary Reacts. Please leave us a like, a positive review, and comment any questions or stories for us to react to. You can find Seminary Reacts on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. See you next time. Bye.